They called me weekend warrior for 6 months. 6 months of scrubbing boots while professional firefighters laughed behind my back. 6 months of cleaning gear, stocking ambulances, and taking every shift nobody else wanted. What they didn't know would have changed everything. But I wasn't ready to tell them. Maybe I never would be. The fluorescent lights in Station 3's equipment bay hummed at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning. I was on my knees, working dried mud off a pair of bunker boots with a brush that had seen better days. The concrete floor was cold, seeping through my work pants like ice water. My name is Morgan Reed. During the week, I worked dispatch for the County Park Service, safe work, quiet work, answering radio calls from lost hikers, logging trail conditions, filing incident reports that nobody would ever read. Nothing like what I used to do. "Hey, weekend girl," the voice cut through the bay like a rusty blade. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. Rhett Donovan. 6 years on the job, permanent smirk, and an ego that barely fit through the bay doors. He was leaning against engine 3, arms crossed over his chest, that smile welded onto his face like it belonged there. Rhett wasn't just a bully, he was the ringleader, the one who set the tone. When he laughed, everyone laughed. When he mocked, everyone followed. "Make sure you get the laces spotless," he said. "We've got a real call later. Can't have the professionals wearing dirty boots." Marcus, the youngest crew member, chimed in immediately. He always did, eager to please, desperate to belong. "Maybe she can polish the engine too. Give her something to do while we actually fight fires. Right, Rhett?" Marcus was the echo, the yes man. He didn't have original thoughts, just borrowed cruelty from whoever held the power. More laughter. Derek stood slightly apart from the others. He wasn't laughing, not directly. But he wasn't stopping it either. His eyes met mine for a split. Second, then slid away. Like he was pretending not to see. Derek was the worst kind. The silent one. The one who noticed everything and said nothing. The one who could have spoken up but chose the easy path instead. Chief Torres walked through the bay, coffee in hand. He saw me on my knees, saw the crew laughing and said nothing, just kept walking. That was worse than the mockery, the silence of authority. I went back to scrubbing, let them have their fun. But then Rhett did something new. He walked over to where I was kneeling and reached down toward my chest. For a moment I thought, but no. He grabbed the volunteer badge clipped to my turnout coat, the cheap plastic one they gave to weekend volunteers. "This badge," he said, holding it up so everyone could see, "is for people who actually do the job." He flicked it with his finger, making it swing. "Not for people who show up twice a month to play dress-up." The laughter was louder now, harder, the kind of laughter that was designed to hurt. I said nothing, just held his gaze until he dropped the badge and walked away. Weekend warrior, part-timer, the woman who played dress-up on Saturdays. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that these hands had once done things they couldn't imagine. But that was another life, another person, someone I was trying very hard not to be anymore. Outside, another siren wailed in the distance, then another. Whatever was burning out there, it was growing. And no one here had any idea what was coming. The nightmares always started the same way. Wind. The sound of wind through burning pines. A freight train made of fire, roaring down a mountainside while my radio screamed with voices I couldn't help. "We're cut off." Shifting. "Where are you?" And then a voice. Calm. Too calm. Saying something I'd never forget. I woke up at 3 a.m. that Saturday morning, drenched in sweat, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The sheets were twisted around my legs like restraints. For a long moment, I just sat there in the darkness, breathing, counting, waiting for my pulse to slow. 4 years. 4 years since I'd walked away from everything. 4 years since I'd sworn I was done. Some promises are easier to make than keep. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from an unknown number, except I knew exactly who it was from. the same number that texted me twice a year without fail. Still thinking of you. Trust your instincts today. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it, like I always did. Instead of going back to sleep, I pulled on my clothes and drove to Station 3 in the pre-dawn darkness. The roads were empty. The town was sleeping, and I needed something to do with my hands before they started shaking again. That's how I ended up on my knees in the equipment bay, scrubbing boots at 6 a.m. while Rhett Donovan and the others made jokes at my expense. The thing about being a volunteer firefighter in a small town is that nobody knows who you were. Nobody asks about your past. They see the weekend scheduling, the part-time commitment, the woman who shows up on Saturdays to do the jobs no one else wants. They don't see the scars, the ones on my hands from old burns, the one on my shoulder from something I didn't talk about, the invisible ones that hurt worse than all the others combined. "Hey, Morgan," I looked up. Sarah Chen, one of the few people at the station who actually used my name, was standing in the doorway, coffee in hand. "Chief wants everyone in the briefing room. Weather's getting interesting." Interesting. That was one word for it. I'd felt it before I'd even gotten out of bed that morning. The pressure, the dryness, the way the wind was starting to move with purpose instead of just drifting. I knew what that meant. I'd learned to read weather patterns in a life I didn't talk about anymore. As I followed Sarah toward the briefing room, I noticed Derek studying me with a strange expression, not mocking, curious, like he was trying to figure something out. "You okay, Morgan?" he asked. "You look like you haven't slept." "I'm fine," I said. "Just an early morning." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on my hands, on the old scars there. He didn't ask about them, and I didn't offer to explain. Outside, the wind picked up, just a little, just enough to notice. At 6:12 a.m., the atmosphere shifted. The pressure dropped 3 millibars in 10 minutes, and nobody noticed except me. Chief David Torres, no relation to Elena Torres as far as I knew, was a solid man in his late 50s. 22 years on the job, competent, careful, the kind of chief who did things by the book because the book existed for a reason. "All right, listen up," he said, tapping a weather map on the screen behind him. "National Weather Service has issued a red flag warning for the county. Relative humidity is going to drop below 15% by afternoon. Winds are expected to gust up to 30 miles an hour." My stomach tightened. 15% humidity with 30-mile winds was a recipe for disaster. "Everything east of the river is under elevated fire risk," Torres continued. "I want everyone on standby. No one goes home until we get the all clear." Rhett raised his hand like a kid in class. "What about the brush fire they spotted yesterday? Forest Service said it was contained." "It was contained," Torres said, "but contained doesn't mean out. With today's conditions, we're keeping an eye on it." I stayed silent in the back of the room, but my mind was racing. The brush fire they were talking about was burning in the National Forest, about 20 miles east of town. I'd heard the radio chatter yesterday while covering dispatch. Small ignition, probably a campfire, contained to under half an acre. But that was yesterday, before the wind. After the briefing, I found myself standing outside the station, staring at the eastern horizon. The sky was that bright, hard blue that meant dry air. No clouds, no moisture, just sun and wind and fuel that hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks. And there, barely visible, maybe 25 miles out, a thin column of smoke. It was too organized, too persistent, too straight. That wasn't campfire smoke. That was the smoke of something that intended to grow. "What you looking at, weekend girl?" Red again, of course. "That smoke column," I said, pointing. "East-northeast, see it?" He squinted, then shrugged. "Forest Service's problem, not ours. Besides, it's tiny. Probably just smoldering from yesterday." I wanted to tell him. Wanted to explain that the most dangerous fires didn't announce themselves with explosions and drama. They started small. They grew quiet. They waited for the wind to shift. And then they ran. But what would be the point? I was weekend warrior. the part-timer, the woman who cleaned boots and stocked ambulances. What could I possibly know about Wildfire? "You're right," I said quietly. "Probably nothing." Rhett nodded, satisfied, and walked back inside. I stayed where I was, watching that column of smoke rise against the blue sky like a warning no one was listening to. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Torres, Elena Torres, not the chief. "Seeing some weather data that concerns me. Be careful today, Ghost. Trust your instincts." I put the phone away without responding, but my instincts were already screaming. The column was growing, not fast. Fire rarely grew fast in the early stages. It built slowly, methodically, consuming fuel and generating heat and waiting for the right conditions to explode. I'd seen this pattern a dozen times before. The quiet buildup, the slow accumulation of energy. And then the moment when everything changed. Back inside, I found myself drawn to the equipment bay. Not to clean, there was nothing left to clean, but to check, to make sure everything was in order. I ran my hands over the hoses on engine 3, checking connections. I tested the water pressure on the auxiliary pump. I verified that the medical kit was fully stocked and the defibrillator was charged. The other firefighters noticed. "What are you doing, weekend girl?" Derek asked, not unkindly. Chief said stand by, not inventory. "Just making sure we're ready," I said, in case. In case of what? The Forest Service has got that fire handled. We're just here in case a kitchen catches fire or someone has a heart attack. He wasn't being cruel. He just didn't understand. None of them did. They'd fought structure fires, controlled environments where the enemy was contained by walls and could be attacked with predictable tactics. They'd never faced something that moved, something that thought, something that could surround you, trap you, and kill you before you even knew what was happening. Wildfire wasn't like structure fire. Wildfire was alive, and it was waking up. By 2:30 that afternoon, the wind had found its voice. It started subtle, just a shift in the air, a change in the way the flag outside the station was moving. But I noticed it. I always noticed. I'd learned to read wind the way other people read books, and this wind had teeth. I was washing engine 3 when I felt it, a gust that came from nowhere, carrying a new quality, dry, electric, the kind of air that made your skin feel tight and your throat feel raw. Dangerous. Inside the station, the radio crackled with routine traffic. Unit 7 clearing scene. Unit 12 responding to medical assist. Normal sounds of a normal day, but nothing about this day felt normal. The smoke column I'd spotted that morning was still there, and it was bigger now. Not dramatically bigger, just persistent, growing by inches instead of feet. The kind of growth that could fool you into thinking nothing was wrong, until it wasn't. "Morgan, you done with that engine yet?" Derek, one of the older firefighters, was standing in the bay door. He was one of the few crew members who didn't actively mock me, though he didn't exactly defend me either. "Almost," I said, "just finishing up." "Good. Chief wants you on radio duty for the next few hours. Sarah's got to leave early. Kid's got a soccer game or something." Radio duty. Of course. The job they gave to people they didn't trust with anything else. On my way. I dried my hands and headed for the dispatch room, a small space at the back of the station filled with monitors and radio equipment. From here, I could monitor all incoming calls, coordinate with county dispatch, and keep track of unit positions. It also gave me access to weather data. I pulled up the forecast on one of the monitors and felt my blood run cold. Relative humidity, 12% and falling. Wind speed, 18 mph, gusting to 25. Wind direction, shifting from northwest to northeast. That wind shift changed everything. A fire that had been burning harmlessly away from populated areas would now be pushed directly toward them. The topography east of town was all uphill slopes and dry brush, perfect conditions for a fire to gain speed and intensity. I pulled up the incident map for the brush fire in the National Forest. As of the last update, it was listed as contained at 15 acres, but that update was 3 hours old. I keyed the radio. Station 3 to Incident Command, requesting current status on the forest fire at grid reference Delta 7. Static. Then a voice I didn't recognize. Station 3, be advised, we're reassessing containment. Fire behavior is unpredictable. Stand by for update. Unpredictable. That word made my stomach drop. I'd heard that word before. Sitting in an incident command tent, listening to Battalion Chief Torres coordinate resources for what everyone thought was a routine brush fire. 2 hours before Ridgeline became a catastrophe. The radio crackled again. All units, be advised. Fire has jumped initial containment line, requesting additional resources. I closed my eyes. It was starting, and no one here understood what was coming. The calls kept coming over the next hour. Fire now estimated at 75 acres and growing. Spot fires reported east of main fire body. Requesting air support, visibility good, wind speed marginal. Each update painted a picture I'd seen before. A fire that was growing faster than resources could contain it. A situation that was escalating from concerning to critical in real time. And nobody at Station 3 seemed to understand. 75 acres? Rhett said, walking past the dispatch room with a sandwich in his hand. That's nothing. Forest Service handles those in their sleep. The wind is pushing it toward populated areas, I said carefully, and it's accelerating. He laughed. Accelerating? What are you, a meteorologist now? Relax, weekend girl. The professionals have it handled. I wanted to grab him by the collar and explain exactly what accelerating meant in the context of wildfire. How a fire could double in size every 30 minutes under the right conditions. How wind-driven flames could outrun a person at full sprint. How even professional crews could get overwhelmed when they underestimated the beast they were fighting. But I didn't, because I was weekend warrior. And weekend warriors didn't contradict professionals. At 4 p.m., Chief Torres called another briefing. Fire's grown to about 150 acres, he said, pointing to a map on the screen. Still 15 miles from the nearest structure, but we're on standby just in case. Engine 7 from the East Station is already en route to assist Forest Service. Should we be doing anything? Someone asked. Right now, no, we wait. This isn't our jurisdiction until it threatens incorporated areas. Wait, the word made my skin crawl. I raised my hand. Chief? Permission to speak? Torres looked surprised. I rarely spoke in briefings. Go ahead, Morgan. The wind data shows a significant shift coming in the next few hours. If that fire keeps growing at its current rate, it could reach the ridge above town by nightfall. From there, structure threats are, I hesitated, inevitable. Silence. Everyone was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. With respect, Rhett said, that smirk creeping back onto his face. Maybe we should leave the fire behavior analysis to people who've actually fought real fires. More laughter, quieter than before, but still there. Chief Torres held up a hand. Morgan, I appreciate the concern, but we've got experienced personnel monitoring the situation. If it escalates, we'll respond. For now, everyone stay on standby. He dismissed the group. I stayed in my seat for a long moment, staring at the map on the screen. The fire was a red blob on the eastern edge, small compared to the vast forest around it. But I knew how fast that blob could grow. I'd watched it happen before, and I'd watched good people die because nobody listened until it was too late. My phone buzzed. Elena Torres again. Heard the forest fires. Growing. How's your crew handling it? I typed back. They're not listening. Her response came immediately. They never do, until they have to. Stay sharp, Ghost. At 5:45 p.m., the alarm finally sounded. Not the full station alert, just the 3-tone signal that meant Engine 3 was being deployed. Chief Torres gathered the primary crew in the bay, his face set in that grim expression that meant business. Fire's at 400 acres now, he said. Forest Service is requesting mutual aid. Engine 3 and Ladder 1 are responding to establish a staging area at the ranger station. 400 acres. It had tripled in less than 2 hours. Rhett was already climbing into his turnout gear, that permanent smirk replaced by something approaching focus. Derek and the others moved with practiced efficiency, checking equipment, testing radios. "What about me?" I asked. Chief Torres barely looked at me. "Volunteer stays at the station, monitor the radio, answer phones. If anyone calls about evacuations, direct them to the county emergency line." "But Chief, you could what, Morgan?" He was already halfway to the engine. "This is a wildland fire. You've got no wildland certification, no experience, nothing. You'd be a liability out there." The words hit like physical blows. No experience, a liability, if only he knew. "Stay here," he repeated. "Keep the station operational. That's an order." The engine doors slammed shut. Lights and sirens erupted into the evening air. And then they were gone, red taillights disappearing down the street while I stood in the empty bay, alone. The radio in the dispatch room crackled with updates. "Engine 3 en route to staging area. ETA 25 minutes. Air tanker making another retardant drop on the east flank. Be advised, spot fires have been reported south of containment line." I sat down in front of the monitors and watched the disaster unfold from a distance. The fire was growing faster now. Every update pushed the numbers higher. 450 acres, 500, 550. The crews on scene were working hard, but they were fighting physics, and physics always won. Wildfire didn't think, didn't hesitate. It just consumed, and the wind was still shifting. By 6:30, the sun was setting, and the sky to the east had turned an apocalyptic orange. Not the soft orange of a normal sunset. This was harsher, angrier. The color of a sky filled with smoke and particulate matter. The color of a fire that was no longer being contained. "Incident command to all units. Fire has jumped Highway 9. I repeat, fire has jumped Highway 9. All units retreat to secondary staging area." My heart stopped. Highway 9 was the main fire break between the forest and the populated areas. If the fire had jumped it, that meant the town was directly in its path. I grabbed my phone and called Chief Torres directly. It rang 4 times before he picked up. "Morgan, I'm busy." "Chief, the fire jumped the highway. It's heading straight for the eastern neighborhoods. You need to—" "I know what it's doing," he snapped. "We're working on it. Just stay at the station and do your job." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, then at the monitor showing weather data and fire progression. The wind was picking up, gusting to 30 now, with higher peaks expected after dark. The fire was moving at an estimated 2 miles per hour, which didn't sound fast until you realized that gave the eastern neighborhoods less than an hour before flames reached the first houses. And the professional crew was 15 miles away, trying to hold a line that had already broken. I pulled up the satellite imagery on one of the dispatch monitors. The fire had gone from a small red blob to something that looked like a spreading wound on the landscape. Spot fires were appearing ahead of the main front, embers carried by wind, landing in dry brush, starting new ignitions. This was how fires became unstoppable, not by burning forward, but by multiplying. The phone on the desk rang. "Fire Station 3, this is Morgan." "Is this the fire department?" A woman's voice, elderly, trembling. "There's smoke. I can see smoke from my window. Should I leave?" "Ma'am, what's your address?" "I'm on Oak Street. 247 Oak Street. My husband can't walk very well. Should we leave?" My chest tightened. Oak Street was on the eastern edge of town, directly in the fire's path. "Ma'am, if you can see smoke, you should start preparing to evacuate. Pack essentials, medications, documents, 1 change of clothes. If you hear sirens or see flames, leave immediately. Don't wait for an official order." "But no one's told us to." "I know, but sometimes you have to trust what you see, not what you're told." I gave her the county emergency line, then hung up. The phone rang again, and again. Each call was another frightened resident. Another person who could see the writing in the sky but hadn't been given official permission to read it. I answered everyone, gave the same advice: trust what you see, prepare now, don't wait. It wasn't my job, it wasn't my authority, but someone had to do it. Through the window, the sky was getting darker, not from sunset, from smoke. A haze was settling over the town, turning the air gray and acrid, and still the radio crackled with updates that made my blood run cold. Fire now estimated at 800 acres, forward rate of spread increasing. Multiple structures threatened on Forest Service land, requesting all available mutual aid. The radio crackled again, this time Rhett's voice, and something was wrong. Engine 3 to Incident Command. We've got a problem. Fire's moving faster than projected. We're getting flanked. The next 15 minutes were chaos. Engine 3, report your position. We're at grid reference Echo 4. Fire is approaching from 3 sides. Request immediate extraction. Engine 3, can you retreat via Forest Road 12? Negative. Road is blocked by downed trees. We're looking for alternatives. I sat frozen in front of the radio, listening to professional firefighters, the same ones who'd called me weekend warrior, fighting to survive. The updates came faster now, each one worse than the last. Ladder 1 is trapped at the same location, cannot extract. Air support is grounded due to wind conditions. All units in the eastern sector shelter in place. I repeat, shelter in place. Shelter in place. That meant they were deploying fire shelters, the thin aluminum cocoons that were a firefighter's last resort when flames overran their position. You climbed inside, pressed your face to the ground, and prayed the fire passed before the shelter failed. I'd seen shelters after a burnover, the melted edges, the scorched remains. I'd carried the body of a man who'd survived ridgeline in one of those shelters. He'd lived another 6 months before the burns finally took him. My phone buzzed. Elena Torres. Watching the scanner, your crew. Trapped, sheltering. A long pause. Then, ghost, I know what you're thinking. Someone has to protect the town. That's not your job anymore. But it was. It had always been my job. I'd just spent 4 years pretending otherwise. The radio crackled with Rhett's voice again, higher pitched now, fear bleeding through every word. Engine 3 to anyone, it's everywhere. We're deploying shelters. If anyone can hear this, we need help. We need static, then silence. Dead air that felt like a grave. I'd heard that sound before, 4 years ago. Different fire, different radio, same silence. The memory hit me like a physical blow, the screaming wind, the wall of flame, the voice on the radio going, quiet mid-sentence. The voice that had trained me, the voice that had believed in me, the voice I'd failed. Get them out. I'll hold the line. And then nothing. Just static. Just silence. Just the sound of a world ending. I'd carried that silence for 4 years. Let it hollow me out. Let it drive me away from everything I'd ever been good at. But this was different. This time, I wasn't trapped in a nightmare. This time, I could do something. I stared at the silent radio for exactly 3 seconds. Then, I stood up. The equipment locker in the back of the bay wasn't locked. Nobody ever bothered, because what was a weekend volunteer going to steal? I opened it and found what I was looking for, my old gear bag. I'd packed it when I first moved here, brought it to the station as a just-in-case measure, then shoved it in the back of the locker and tried to forget it existed. Inside were yellows, Nomex pants and jacket, fire-resistant, rated for wildland operations, old leather, old. Gloves still stiff from last use, goggles, a handheld radio, and at the bottom, a turnout coat with a single word stenciled on the back, a name I hadn't used in 4 years, a name I'd tried to bury. I pulled it on, zipped up, grabbed my helmet. In the mirror by the door, I caught a glimpse of myself. Not Morgan Reed, weekend volunteer. Not the woman who scrubbed boots and answered phones. Someone else. Someone I'd been running from for a very long time. The person I'd been trying to kill with silence had just clawed her way back to the surface. The Brush 4 truck was the oldest piece of equipment in the station. Nobody used it anymore. Too small for structure fires, too outdated for the primary response fleet. It sat in the corner of the bay like a forgotten relic, collecting dust and the occasional spider web. But I'd spent the last 6 months maintaining it, changing filters, checking pumps, replacing seals, because part of me had always known this day might come. The diesel engine turned over on the first try, a healthy rumble that sounded like salvation. I climbed into the driver's seat and reached for my radio. My hand wasn't shaking anymore. For the first time in years, it was rock steady. Steady hands. Captain Webb always said that was my superpower. Station 3 to all units, I said, keying the mic. This is Morgan Reed. I'm responding to the fire. Any volunteers willing to assist, meet me at the community center. We're making a stand. Static for a heartbeat. Then Chief Torres's voice crackling with fury. Morgan, negative. You are not authorized to... I turned off the radio. Authorization didn't matter anymore. The professionals were trapped. The town was burning. And I was the only firefighter left who knew how to fight wildfire. The only one who'd done it before and survived. I pulled Brush 4 out of the bay and into a world that had changed dramatically in the last hour. The sky was a deep, angry orange, lit from within by flames that were closer than they should have been. Ash was falling like snow, gray flakes that settled on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. Evacuees streamed past me in the opposite direction, cars packed with belongings, frightened families, pets and carriers. They were leaving. I was going in. At the community center, 3 people were waiting in the parking lot. Not firefighters, just civilians in work clothes, looking equal parts terrified and determined. A retired teacher named Dave Winters. His granddaughter attended Willowbrook Elementary. A bank manager named Sarah Mitchell. She'd called in sick to be here. A carpenter named Tom Reyes. His family had lived in this valley for 4 generations. None of them were trained. None of them had fought wildfire. None of them had any business being here. But they were here anyway. What's the plan? Dave asked, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. I looked at them. 3 ordinary people willing to risk everything for their community, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. We're building a fire break, I said, my command voice taking over. 1/2 a mile east, there's a natural gap in the fuel load, an old meadow where the brush is thinner. If we can create a backburn there, we might be able to stop the head of the fire. Sarah frowned. Backburn? You mean set another fire? Exactly. We burn out the fuel between here and the main fire. When it arrives, there's nothing left to consume. Classic hotshot tactic. I checked the equipment on Brush 4 with practiced efficiency. It's dangerous. Time it wrong and we could trap ourselves. Get it right and we save the town. I met each of their eyes in turn. Anyone wants to leave, do it now. No judgment. Nobody moved. Tom squared his shoulders. What do you need us to do? The drip torch felt familiar in my hands, like greeting an old friend after a long separation. Fuel mixture, check. Ignition system, check. I hadn't held one in 4 years, but muscle memory kicked in like I'd never stopped. Some skills, once learned, never really leave you. Dave, you're on the water tender, I commanded, my voice carrying that authority it hadn't held in this town before. Keep the pressure steady. Sarah, you're my lookout, eyes on the main fire at all times. Tell me the instant it changes direction or speed. Tom, radio duty. Keep dispatch updated, even if they don't respond. They moved without question, trusting me in a way the professional crew never had, in a way I wasn't sure I deserved. The meadow was exactly where I remembered from my recon runs, a natural depression in the terrain where an old creek had once flowed. Grass instead of brush, thin fuel instead of thick. If I could burn it out before the main fire arrived, we'd have a fighting chance. And ignited the drip torch. Fire dripped from the spout in controlled drops, each one landing in dry grass and spreading in a careful line. Behind me, the backburn began to crawl, eating fuel, creating the black line of already consumed earth that would serve as our barrier. Each step was measured, deliberate, Too fast and the backburn would get away from me. Too slow and the main fire would arrive before I finished. The margin for error was measured in seconds. "Morgan!" Sarah's voice cut through the night. "Main fire just crested the eastern ridge. It's moving fast, really fast." I looked up and felt my stomach drop. She was right. The fire wasn't walking anymore. It was running. Wind-driven flames raced down the mountainside like a living thing. Individual trees torching like signals, crowns igniting in explosions of orange and red. Maybe 15 minutes, maybe 10. "Pick up the pace," I muttered to myself, laying fire faster. Behind me I heard Sarah's voice crack with fear. "Morgan, the fire. It's so close. I can feel the heat." And then I heard something else. The roar of Tom's pickup engine, moving, accelerating. "Tom, stop!" But he was already driving, panicking, trying to get away from the approaching flames. The pickup lurched forward, heading directly toward the unburned fuel bed east of our position. If he drove through there, he'd ignite the entire section, create a new fire front, trap all of us. "Tom, brake, now!" I dropped the drip torch and sprinted toward the moving vehicle. 10 feet, 20. The pickup was gaining speed. In training, they taught us that people panic, that civilian volunteers will break under pressure, that the difference between life and death is often one person staying calm when everyone else loses their minds. I caught up to the driver's side window. Tom's face was white, his eyes wild with terror. "Tom!" I grabbed the door frame. "Look at me! Look at me!" He turned. His foot was still on the gas, but the truck was slowing. "You're okay," I said, my voice steady, calm, the way I'd been trained. "But if you drive forward, you'll ignite that brush. You'll trap us. I need you to stop, right now." His foot moved. Brake. The truck shuddered to a halt. For a moment, he just sat there, breathing hard, tears running down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I've never... It's okay." I squeezed his shoulder. "You stopped. That's what matters. Now get back to your position and trust me. Can you do that?" He nodded. Slowly. The fear was still there, but something else too. Something like resolve. I'd seen that look before, on the faces of rookies who'd just survived their first bad moment, the moment that separated the ones who'd make it from the ones who wouldn't. Tom was going to make it. I retrieved the drip torch and resumed laying fire. Faster now. The main fire was close enough to hear individual trees exploding. Fire doesn't care about brave, only prepared. I wasn't stronger than the professionals. I was just earlier. "All stations clear this channel, now." The voice that crackled through Tom's radio wasn't just angry. It was absolute. The kind of voice that made seasoned firefighters stop mid-sentence. "I want Ghost. I want her on this frequency in the next 30 seconds or heads will roll. State Fire Marshal. Elena Torres." My heart stopped. She was tracking the backburn. She knew. I keyed my handheld. "State Marshal, this is Morgan Reed. I'm Ghost. I'm the operator." Static. Then, "I didn't authorize this burn, Morgan." Her voice dropped, still commanding but different now. "I authorized you 4 years ago. That authorization never expired." I felt something shift in my chest. "Now tell me your situation." "Backburn 70% complete. Main fire 8 minutes out. 3 civilian volunteers, green but holding." "Copy that. All air assets clear Foxtrot 7 immediately. Burn ops in." Progress. A pause. "If Ghost goes down out there, that's on me. Not the town, not the volunteers. Me. So everyone stay the hell out of her way." Another pause. Quieter now. "You disappeared for 4 years, Ghost. I thought you were done." "So did I said. "But some skills don't stay buried." "I'm inbound by helicopter. ETA 15 minutes. Don't die before I get there." I was halfway through the southern line when Elena's voice came back on the radio. "Ghost, I've got an update on your Station 3 crew. They're alive. Fire passed north of their position. They sheltered successfully. Extraction team is en route." Relief flooded through me like cold water. Rhett, Derek, Chief Torres, all of them, alive. But you need to know something else, Elena continued. Wind's about to shift again. NOAA is tracking a pressure change moving in from the west. You've got maybe 5 minutes before the wind direction reverses. 5 minutes. The backburn was maybe 60% complete. I looked at the main fire. It was close now, close enough to hear. That sound that Wildfire makes when it's running hard. A roar that was part freight train, part hungry beast, part force of nature that cared nothing for human plans or human lives. A sound that haunted my nightmares. But tonight, I wasn't afraid. Tonight, I was back where I belonged. Sarah, how far out is the head of fire? 1/4 mile maybe, moving fast. Dave, how's the water pressure? Steady at 150 psi. I made a decision. The southern line wouldn't be complete in time, but if I could connect it to the natural rock outcropping at the southwest corner. Everyone in vehicles, now. What? But the line isn't... I know, we're repositioning. The wind's about to shift, which means the fire's about to change direction. If we're not ready, we'll be caught in the open. They moved, faster than I expected. In 30 seconds, everyone was mounted up, Dave in brush 4, Sarah and Tom in Tom's pickup with the portable pump. And then the wind shifted. I felt it before I saw it, that atmospheric pressure change every experienced wildland firefighter learns to recognize in their bones. The air went still for exactly 2 seconds. Then it hit from the west. The main fire, which had been racing toward our incomplete fire line, suddenly staggered. Flames that had been laying horizontal bent, sideways, then backward as the new wind caught them. But that wasn't good news. It was different bad news. Because now the fire wasn't heading toward our prepared defenses. It was heading toward the Oak Street neighborhood, 3 blocks of houses, directly in its new path. "Morgan!" Sarah shouted. "The fire! It's turning!" I was already driving. "Everyone follow me. We're making a structure defense. Tom, radio Marshal Torres. Tell her we're repositioning to protect Oak Street." The pickup accelerated behind me, dust kicking up in the headlights. Through my windshield, I could see the first houses coming into view. Modest homes with maintained yards, each one representing someone's entire life. And behind them, getting closer by the second, a wall of flame. The Oak Street neighborhood wasn't large, maybe 40 houses spread across 3 blocks, but right now, it was everything. I positioned brush 4 at the intersection of Oak and Maple, creating a barrier between the approaching fire and the first row of houses. The truck's water cannon could throw a stream 150 feet, enough to knock down spot fires before they established, enough to buy time at least. Buying time was all we could do now. "Dave, keep that pump running. Maximum pressure. Sarah, I need you on the roof of that 2-story." I pointed to a house with a flat garage roof. "Watch for embers. Any fire that starts, you call it out immediately." "What about me?" Tom asked. "You're with me. We're doing a rapid survey of every house on this block, looking for ignition sources, dry leaves in gutters, wood piles against structures, propane tanks, anything that could catch." We moved fast, house to house, pulling dried debris away from foundations, noting which houses had cedar shake roofs, death traps in a firestorm, and which had clay or metal, survivable, disconnecting propane lines where we could reach them. The first embers started falling when we were halfway through the block. They drifted down like snow made of fire, tiny orange sparks that floated on the wind, looking almost peaceful until they landed on something that would burn. "Ember shower!" Sarah's voice rang out from her rooftop position. "Southwest corner, heavy concentration." I looked up just as the main fire crested the ridge above the neighborhood. Not the distant glow we'd been watching for hours. This was close, maybe 300 yards, close enough to feel the radiant heat pressing against my face, close enough to hear individual trees exploding as the fire superheated their sap, close enough to smell death. "Dave, water on the southwest corner, full stream." The cannon swung around, and a powerful jet of water arced through the air, hammering the corner house just as a shower of embers landed on its roof. Steam exploded upward. Good sign. That meant we'd caught it before ignition. But more embers were falling, Dozens, hundreds, a deadly game of whack-a-mole that we were barely winning. "Morgan," Tom was pointing toward the end of the block. "That house, something's wrong." I followed his gesture and felt my blood turn to ice. The corner house, white siding, blue trim, nice garden out front, and behind it a 500-gallon propane tank surrounded by falling embers like fireflies from hell. The tank was already heating. I could see the shimmer of superheated air rising from its surface, and I could hear something worse, a high-pitched whistle that meant metal under stress, gas escaping from a relief valve, bleave, boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion. If that tank failed, it would create a fireball that could level everything within 50 feet, including my crew, including everything we were trying to save. "Everyone back!" I shouted, grabbing the handline from Brush 4. "Get behind the engine, now!" But even as I gave the order, I was running toward the tank, because someone had to cool it down, someone had to keep it from exploding. And there was no one else. There was never anyone else. That was the burden of being Ghost. I grabbed the hose and ran. Behind me, I heard Tom calling my name, heard Sarah's voice on the radio, urgent and afraid. But I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. 60 feet to the tank, 50, 40. The heat was building with every step. Not just ambient temperature, radiant heat, the invisible killer that could cook you from the inside out before flames ever touched your skin. I'd seen it happen, seen firefighters walk into radiant zones and collapse before they even understood what was wrong. My turnout gear was rated for this, my Nomex was rated for this. But ratings were just numbers. Reality was the sweat pouring down my back and the way my lungs burned with every breath. 30 feet. The tank loomed ahead of me, white metal gleaming orange in the firelight. I could see the shimmer of heat distortion around it, the way the air itself was bending and warping. And I could hear the whistle, that high-pitched shriek that meant metal under stress, gas escaping through the safety valve. In training, they taught us that a bleave could happen without warning. One moment, a pressurized tank under thermal stress. The next, a fireball that could level half a block. 20 feet. I was close enough now to feel the tank's heat through my gloves, close enough to see the paint bubbling on its surface. The hose was heavy in my hands. The water pressure was good. Dave was doing his job perfectly. I aimed for the top of the tank where heat concentrated, where failure would begin. The approach to the propane tank felt like walking into a furnace. Radiant heat pressed against me from all sides, from the approaching fire, from the tank itself, from the embers falling like rain around me. My Nomex was rated for these conditions, but that didn't mean I couldn't feel the temperature climbing. That didn't mean my skin wasn't already slick with sweat. 30 feet, 20, 10. The tank loomed above me, white metal gleaming orange in the firelight. The whistle from the relief valve was louder now, a continuous shriek that meant internal pressure was approaching critical levels. I hit the tank with water. The spray was wide, covering as much surface as possible. Steam erupted instantly, great clouds of white that obscured my vision and made the air feel like hot soup. But steam was good. Steam meant I was drawing heat away from the metal. Steam meant the temperature was dropping. If I could keep the pressure down for 60 seconds, the fire would pass. The immediate danger would end. 55 seconds. Behind me, I could hear the roar of the main fire as it hit the edge of the neighborhood, trees exploding, fences igniting, the sound of structures being tested by forces they were never designed to withstand. 40 seconds. The embers were falling thicker now. My coat was covered with them, tiny burning spots that would have ignited regular clothing in seconds. I felt one hit the back of my neck, searing pain that I ignored through pure will. "Ghost, you need to get out of there," Elena's voice crackled through my radio. "Fire's passing through the neighborhood now. You've got maybe 30 seconds before you're cut off." 30 seconds. But the tank still wasn't safe. 25. I adjusted my stance, widened the spray pattern. The steam was so thick I could barely see the tank anymore. Just white on white on white, 20 seconds, focus, breathe, trust the training. Captain Webb's voice in my head, as clear as if he were Horfers standing beside me. The same words he'd said 1,000 times during drills. The same calm certainty that had made him the best wildland firefighter I had ever known. "You've got this, Ghost. You've always had this." 15 seconds. The whistle from the relief valve began to fade, pressure dropping, temperature normalizing. The tank was going to hold. 10 seconds. I could feel the main fire passing behind me now, the heat doubling, then tripling as the flames raced through the backyards. But I didn't run. You don't run from the sound. You run from structural collapse, from wind shifts, from things that will kill you faster than flame. Sound is just fire talking. Heat is fire acting. 5 seconds. The whistle stopped. I held the spray for another 3 seconds, safe practice, making sure the metal had really cooled, and then I dropped the line and ran. The wall of flame passed through the backyard 10 feet behind me. Close enough to feel the push of superheated air. Close. Enough to singe the hair on my arms, but not close enough to catch me. I'd beaten it. Again. Elena Torres's helicopter touched down in the Willowbrook Elementary parking lot at 11:47 p.m. The fire was contained now, mostly. Some hot spots still burned on the eastern ridge, but the main threat had passed. Engine companies from 3 counties were working the perimeter. Air tankers had resumed drops now that the wind had calmed. The organized chaos of major incident response was in full swing. But it was my backburn, my structure defense, that had saved the town. As I sat on the bumper of Brush 4, still in my yellows, a familiar voice called out from behind me. "Excuse me, are you the woman from the fire station?" I turned. An elderly woman was walking toward me, supporting herself on her husband's arm. He moved slowly. A walker, I realized. They'd made it out. 247 Oak Street. "I called you," she said, her voice trembling. "Earlier tonight, you told me to trust what I saw, to leave before the official order." I nodded. "I remember. We almost didn't listen. Harold said we should wait for the sirens." She squeezed her husband's hand. "But then I smelled the smoke, and I remembered what you said. Trust what you see." So we left. The house at 247 Oak Street was gone now. I'd seen it burn from 2 blocks away, but they were alive. "Our house is gone," she continued, "but we're here because of you." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. She reached out and squeezed my hand, hard, with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for answering the phone." Then she walked away, leaning on her husband, heading toward the evacuation shelter. Alive. Because someone had answered a phone call they weren't authorized to answer. Elena Torres was watching. She didn't say anything, just nodded once, slowly. Then Engine 3 appeared on the road, the professional crew finally returning from their shelter site, extracted by ground teams after the fire passed. I watched them climb down, Rhett first, then Derek, then Chief, Torres, then the others, all of them moving with the slow, careful steps of people who'd been fundamentally changed. They stopped when they saw me. Really saw me. Elena didn't introduce me. She just spoke one sentence. "Ghost. It's been a long time." Silence. Rhett's mouth fell open. Derek, the one who'd noticed my scars that morning, took an involuntary step backward. Chief Torres looked like he'd been struck. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For a full 10 seconds, there was only the sound of distant sirens and the crackle of dying flames. Then, Elena turned to Chief Torres. Her voice was ice. "You left this woman on dispatch." Torres said nothing. She was hotshot. Enough said. The silence that followed was devastating. Nobody needed the full resume. Nobody needed the list of fires or the years of service. Hotshot was enough. Everyone in fire service knew what that meant. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear. Derek's face was white. Rhett stared at his boots. The same boots I'd scrubbed that morning. Elena turned to Rhett. "You, Donovan, you're relieved of lead duty, effective immediately." Rhett didn't argue. He just nodded. Some consequences don't need explanation. They just arrive. "I didn't know," Torres managed finally. That's exactly the problem, Elena said quietly. Rhett Donovan was the first one off the engine. He looked different than he had that morning. The smirk was gone. His face was pale beneath the soot, and his eyes had that distant, haunted look of someone who'd stared at mortality through a thin layer of aluminum foil, the look of a man who'd waited for death in a fire shelter, praying he'd survive. The rest of the crew followed. Derek, Chief Torres, Marcus, the others, all of them wearing the same expression, all of them moving with the slow, careful steps of people who'd been fundamentally changed by the last few hours. They stopped when they saw me, really saw me, for the first time since I'd arrived at Station 3 6 months ago. I was still wearing my yellows, still covered in ash and sweat, and for the first time, they could see the words stenciled on the back of my turnout coat. Elena didn't introduce me. She just spoke one sentence. Ghost? It's been a long time. Silence. Rhett's mouth fell open. Derek, the one who'd noticed my scars that morning, took an involuntary step backward. Chief Torres looked like he'd been struck. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For a full 10 seconds, there was only the sound of distant sirens and the crackle of dying flames. Then, Rhett's eyes went to my hands, to the old burn scars, to the way I held myself, not like a volunteer, but like someone who'd done this 1,000 times. You, his voice was barely a whisper, you saved the neighborhood while we were trapped. I said nothing, just held his gaze. We called you weekend warrior, he continued. We made you clean boots. I know what you called me. My voice was flat, cold, not angry, just empty. He opened his mouth to say more, an apology, probably, an explanation. But I turned away before he could speak. Some things didn't need words, and some apologies came too late to matter. Derek stood apart from the others. He was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. I noticed, he said, quietly. This morning, the scars, the way you moved. I almost said something. Why didn't you? He shook his head. I don't know. I should have. I looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Once. That was enough. For now. 6 months later. I stood at the front of Station 3's training room. 30 faces, new volunteers, professionals who wanted to learn. Nobody called me weekend warrior anymore. Dave sat in the front row, certified now. Sarah was in paramedic school. Tom ran the equipment bay. Derek asked real questions. They'd started as civilians. They'd become something else. Red attended every class, back row, quiet, taking notes instead of making jokes. We weren't friends, maybe never would be. But some things don't need to be fixed to work. After class, the room emptied. I stayed at my desk, on my phone, a photograph. Captain Webb and me, covered in ash, grinning at a camera neither of us expected to see again. Still trying, I whispered. No answer. There. Never was. Outside, Willowbrook slept. The hills were scarred but healing. The night was quiet. I touched the window glass, cold, clean, the kind of quiet that felt like waiting. Some wounds never heal. They just become part of the landscape. The scar becomes the story. The story becomes the lesson. I stopped running, but I never stopped carrying. Respect isn't earned by titles. It's earned in the moment nobody wants. And fire always finds who's real.